The Chicken Asylum, an Alex Reynolds mystery. Author, Fred Hunter. Publisher, St. Martin's, Griffin, New York. Narrator, Eric Aust. Chapter 3. Despite our many years together, I still love to watch Peter get ready for work in the morning, if only out of the corner of my eye, while I'm getting dressed. He's precise about it, while not appearing to pay any particular attention to what he's doing, which is completely in character for a man who gives no indication of realizing how beautiful he really is. He managed to stay in shape despite not having a lot of time for the gym. His chest is firm and his stomach flat. And all the time we've been together, there hasn't been a lot of change, except for a slight deepening of the lines around his eyes and a couple of gray hairs in the center of the dusting of brown on his chest. And I love him so much that just the thought of growing old with him gets me excited. He slipped his arms into the sleeves of a tan shirt that made his skin look a shade darker, tucked it into his light brown pants, and buttoned everything up. He then knotted a coordinated tie around his neck, pulling the knot to his Adam's apple and getting the back end just a hint shorter than the front. Perfect on the first try. I don't remember ever seeing him have to tie a tie twice. As he ran a brush through his dark brown hair, I stood next to him and looked at our reflections. We couldn't be more different. Our basic build is the same, although I'm not as firm as he is. But I'm light-skinned with his blue eyes and hair that was once unkindly referred to as dishwater blonde. Next to me, Peter looks downright Mediterranean. After a moment, he noticed the puckered look on my face. "What?" he asked my reflection. "After you've been married for a long time, aren't you supposed to start looking like each other?" He laughed and laid the brush on top of the dresser. "Only on television. Real life doesn't have a casting director. What brought that up?" I squinted at my reflection, then at his. "I don't see it. There's no way anyone would take us for brothers." He rolled his eyes. "Geez, Alex, are you still on that?" James was just trying to make sense out of something he didn't understand. I didn't help any. Peter turned from my image to the original. "What's really the matter?" "I've never done that before," I replied after pursing my lips. "What?" "I'm usually perfectly honest about our relationship. It made me feel just creepy to hedge like that. I half expected a cock to crow." He smiled at me lovingly. "You didn't lie. You just didn't tell him everything." I snorted. "I've been working with Nelson too long. It's rubbing off." "This isn't anything like Nelson. You just didn't want to confuse James more than he has been. You were thinking of him." He gave me a peck on the forehead. "Besides, it's none of his business anyway." "I guess," I replied, somewhat mollified. "But if he asks me about our relationship again, I'm going to tell him straight out. Confusion or no confusion." "That's my little activist," he said, giving my cheek a pinch in a perfectly accurate imitation of Mother. Mother had decided to serve breakfast in the kitchen rather than the dining room, reasoning that if we were supposed to provide a friendly atmosphere for the first phase of James's transition to American life, we should treat him like one of the family rather than a guest. I couldn't help but think the poor kid was going to get a warped picture of the American family from a British expatriate, her son and his husband, but then no more warped than he would get from television or the religious wrong. When Peter and I came into the kitchen, Mother was busily stirring a skillet full of scrambled eggs, while another pan sizzled with brown sausages. She paused in her stirring just long enough to snatch the toast that had just popped up from the toaster and whisk another pair of slices into it. She reminded me of one of the robots in those Home of the Future cartoons Warner Brothers used to put out. The air was full of the heavy, alluring smell of grease. "Hoo!" Mother said over her shoulder when she noticed us. Would you butter those, darling? She jutted the egg-caked spoon at a plate of toast sitting on the counter. Sure, I replied. I'm afraid I got started a bit late. Know it. The first morning James is here, and I have to oversleep. Well, he's not down yet, said Peter as he poured orange juice into the glasses that had already been laid out. And I hardly think he'll be starving this morning after the way he packed dinner away, I added. He didn't really eat all that much, Mother said, shooting a chastising glance at me as she turned the sausages. Although he did do it rather quickly. She laid the spatula on the counter and picked up the oversized spoon she'd been using on the eggs. She then tilted the skillet just a touch and gave the mass another healthy stir. These look done. Would you go and tell James it's time for breakfast? Okay. I put down the butter knife and brushed the crumbs from my hands, then started to go. But the minute I turned around, I let out a startled cry. James was standing in the doorway. There was something a bit too creeping through the underbrush, with a bolo between the teeth about the way he'd silently appeared behind us, just like in my nightmares. I'm sorry, I gasped out, putting a hand to my racing heart. You startled me. He looked befuddled. I'm sorry? Nonsense, said Mother, waving me off. I'm glad you came down on your own. It shows you're feeling a bit more at home. Or that he smelled the food, I whispered to Peter. I let out another yelp at the sharp poke to my ribs. Boys, stop playing, said Mother. Then she turned back to James. Have a seat, love. Thank you. He crossed to the front of the table and sat down. This morning he was dressed in a white shirt and navy blue chinos with a black belt, along with white socks and black shoes. He looked exotically preppy. How'd you sleep? Mother asked. Good. Much good. Mother began scooping the eggs into a serving bowl. Poor thing, you were absolute dead last night. His forehead creased. Dead? It's just an expression. It means you were very tired. Yes, I was. As soon as we sat down to eat, it became apparent that Mother wasn't going to allow any of the awkwardness or embarrassment of last night's meal. She kept up a steady flow of prattle so effortlessly that you would have thought she was in running for Hostess of the Year. She did a wonderful job of it for the most part. However, I almost choked when she said in the most natural way possible, You know, I've never been to Iraq. How's the weather there? I didn't hear his reply because I was busy coughing into my paper napkin. This really was taking the British obsession with the weather a bit far. Amazingly enough, she managed to draw James out a bit in his halting English. He told us a little about his country. He said nothing about the army, and none of us asked. Still, the bulk of the conversation fell to Mother, with Peter and I adding an occasional when prompted by her, or an interested whenever James chose to speak. James kept his head lowered as if passionately interested in the contents of his plate, although he was eating considerably more slowly than the night before. One thing I found a little unnerving was that several times I noticed him shifting his eyes back and forth between Peter and me. I didn't know if he was still trying to put two and two together or if he'd figured it out and was having trouble dealing with it. Either way, it reaffirmed my resolve to be completely upfront with him should he broach the topic again. When we'd finished eating, Peter got up and said, Well, I'd better get to work. And I'll get this lot cleaned up, Mother chimed in, rising with a plate in each hand. I help, said James. No, you don't need to do that. She broke off, then added, You can if you'd like. I'd certainly appreciate it. He picked up the other two plates and followed her to the sink, while I walked Peter to the front door. You should go out today, he said as he slipped into his jacket. Why? It'll keep you from sitting around the house wondering what they're saying in the debriefing. I laughed. You're probably right. He put his arms around my neck and touched his lips to mine, holding them there for several seconds before releasing me. See you later, honey, he said as he opened the door. I closed it after him. When I turned around, James was standing in the kitchen doorway, staring at me with saucer eyes. I smiled at him and went up the stairs. Nelson arrived so promptly at 9 o'clock that I suspected he'd been waiting on the front stoop with a stopwatch. He was accompanied by Dunning and another man he introduced as Lester Bagnald, whose job it was to serve as interpreter in case James's English should fail him in fulfillment of his part of the bargain. Bagnald was a weedy young man, all knees and elbows, and had thick, nearly black hair that looked as if he combed it with a garden rake. He wore a sweater vest that was too big for him, possibly because they don't knit them that long and thin, gray corduroy slacks, and a pair of brown plastic framed glasses, and they were in a perpetual state of sliding down his nose each time he pushed them back up automatically without seeming to notice he was doing it, like a man with an elaborate tic. Although Mother had made some inroads in getting James to open up over breakfast at the sight of the agents, he immediately reverted to the sheepish, cautious animal he was when he arrived. "So, Gene, where can we set up?" Nelson asked. "You can use the dining table, if that's not too public." "That will be fine. Gentlemen." He led the three of them to the table. As they started to take seats, James nudged Dunning away from the chair at the foot of the table, then quickly sat down. He glanced over at me and smiled. "Let's get started," Nelson said. He laid his briefcase flat on the table, opened it, and brought out a tape recorder and a set of maps that looked almost like blueprints. Only they were musty white instead of blue, and unrolled them. "Could I get you some coffee or anything?" Mother asked, hovering in the kitchen doorway. "Yes, thank you. That would be nice," Nelson replied. Mother went into the kitchen. Nelson flattened out one of the maps and was about to speak when suddenly he stopped. He raised his eye to mine. "We'll be a while, Alex." "Oh, yes, of course," I stammered, my cheeks reddening. I joined Mother in the kitchen, closing the swinging door behind me. She was filling the filter of our coffee maker. "Well, I've been summarily dismissed," I said. What, love?" "I was ordered out of the room in the nicest possible terms." "Were you planning to stay in there?" "I thought it might be interesting." "Really?" she said with surprise. "I should think it would be deadly dull watching them map out Iraq." I stared at her for a second. "Have you ever noticed how bizarre our normal conversations have become?" "You know what I mean," she said with a backward flip of her hand. "I can't imagine you being interested in what they are doing." "All right." I thought maybe James could use a friendly face. She looked even more surprised. "Really?" "Yeah. Did you notice the way he tensed up when they got here?" She sucked in her lips for a moment, glanced in the direction of the dining room, then leaned close to me, keeping her voice very low as she narrowed. "Yes, I did notice, but I think there's other reasons for that, don't you?" "What?" "Well, after all, however you look at it, he's betraying his country, isn't he?" "That's putting it a bit strongly." "I don't mean anything by it. In his case, all it proves is that he's got a conscience, and I'm glad he's doing it. We don't want anyone having those weapons, do we? But you have to remember that he's still going against the way he was brought up, and that can't be easy for him." "I never thought of it that way. Poor kid." She smiled at me lovingly. "You know, sometimes I think you're softer than I am." "There's no need to get insulting," I replied. The interrogation, or should I say, the debriefing, went on for a full 8 hours with barely a pause for lunch. As the day wore on, Mother became increasingly solicitous about James's welfare and interrupted them with growing frequency to see if he wanted anything. Several times over the course of the day, I passed through the dining room on the way to the kitchen, each time trying to maintain the "I'm alone here and there's nothing going on around me" attitude of a daily commuter, so that our friendly neighborhood spies wouldn't think I was spying on them. Every time I passed, James looked up and watched me as if drowning for want of a friend, however foreign, while Bagnald babbled at him in Arabic. By the time they'd finished for the day and Nelson and company had departed, poor James looked like he'd had a slow pass through an old-fashioned ringer. He slumped on the couch, with his hands on his stomach, fingers intertwined. There were small crescent-shaped stains under his arms and bags under his eyes. He had trouble keeping his eyes open as we watched the early evening news, and he nodded off before Mother came out to set the table for dinner. "Poor little thing," she said. I joined her as she quietly placed the silverware by the plates. "He looks all in." "Nelson and his pals are so eager to get what they want. They seem to forget he's a human being," I said indignantly. "Hell, he hardly even got a break for lunch." "I think I may have to have a word with Larry tomorrow." She laid the last knife down with a loud thunk. James was still dozing in front of the TV when Peter got home from work. He greeted me with a kiss and asked me how the day had gone. "Shh," I replied, motioning toward our sleeping soldier. "I'll tell you later." We didn't wake James, and Mother was about to put dinner on the table. He roused groggily as I gently shook his shoulder. "I'm sorry." His voice was dry and cracked with overuse. "I was tired." "There's no need to apologize. Dinner's about ready. You want to eat, right?" His eyes lit up at the mention of food. "Yes, thank you. I wash first." He rose from the couch and bounded up the stairs as if he was afraid all the food would be gone if he took too long. Dinner that evening was a bit fancier than the night before. Mother had made a large beef roast with carrots, onions, and enough boiled potatoes to feed an army, let alone one little soldier. Once again, James greedily cleaned his plate 2 or 3 times. After the rigors he'd been put through that day, and after what Mother had said about how he was essentially betraying his country, I could have cried just watching him. It was as if he'd had to sell his soul to get a decent meal. I wondered if there would come a time when he'd think that was poor compensation for destroying his life as he knew it, even if that life had left a lot to be desired. Mother didn't attempt to force a conversation, figuring that James had had his fill for the day, but he was much more talkative on his own. "I am tired," he said, stabbing his second helping of beef with his fork and sawing it with his knife. "Questions, questions, questions." "Surely you expected that," said Mother. He squared the slice of beef with his knife and popped it in his mouth. "Yes, but so many. They want to empty my head in one day." "Yes, well, I thought they went a bit over the top myself." "And there are more days of it." "Don't you worry, love. You'll get through it, and you'll be the better for it." He stared down at his plate, toying with one of the potatoes with his fork. His eyes stirred up. "I feel I cannot think any more." "And Nelson has that effect on people," I said. Mother eyed him with compassion. "You're doing very well." From her expression, I wouldn't have wanted to be Nelson when she had her little word with him. "I feel like I am on..." His voice trailed off, and his breathing quickened as he searched for the right word. "Purgatory," I offered. His face fell open. "What is this?" Peter looked at me across the table with a single raised eyebrow, challenging me to explain. Purgatory. I mean, you feel like you're stuck between one world and another." James brightened. "Yes, this is it." He paused, and the brightness drained away from him. He looked as if he were deflating. "Only I don't know what the new world is. I feel I'm in a cage." "But you mustn't," said Mother. "It's only a couple of more days now, then you'll be off on a new life, and you'll settle in very quickly." There was a beat, then James grunted and dove back into his food. We spent the rest of the evening in front of the television. Peter and I close together at one end of the couch, and James at the other. He alternated between being fascinated by American TV and being fascinated by us. Although he tried to keep his eyes riveted to the various programs, several times I caught him shooting sidelong glances in our direction. The attention made me so nervous that at one point, when Peter laid his hand carefully on my leg, I quickly crossed my legs to knock it off. He looked at me questioningly, and I gave a slight nod in the direction of our guest. Peter sighed heavily and folded his hands in his laps. By 9 o'clock, James was nodding off again. But even though he was clearly exhausted, he made no mood to retire for the night. Until Peter and I announced that we were going to bed. I was beginning to wonder if it was considered bad manners in Iraq to go to bed before your hosts. We said goodnight to Mother, who'd spent the evening poring over more magazines at the dinner table, and led James upstairs. "Good night," I said as he went toward his room. "Yes, good night." I could feel his eyes on us as we went down the hall. He didn't go into his room until we closed our door. "Have you noticed the way he watches us?" I asked as we got undressed. "The only thing I've noticed lately is you're acting like a nut," Peter replied without rancor. "I'm serious." "So am I. What was that business of pushing my hand away?" I was going to try claiming it was an accident, but that sounded lame, even to me. I tossed my jeans over the back of the chair by our bathroom door. "It's just made me uncomfortable with James there." "Did you really not notice him watching us?" "Maybe a little." Peter relented as he draped his trousers over mine. "He's probably just curious. Why should you care?" "I don't." He tilted his head and pursed his lips into a little smile. I backed down. "I don't know," I said as I stripped off my shorts. "It's just, he's gone through so much already, and you should have seen him. Nelson's boys treated him. I don't want to do anything to freak him out even more. What would he think if he knew about us? I mean, they shoot gay people over there, don't they?" "Alex." "They shoot gay people over here, too." He dropped his khaki boxers to the floor, lifted them up with his foot, and grabbed them, then tossed them on the chair. "I know," I said with a sigh, hoping to derail him before he'd fully climbed up on his soapbox. He came to me and wrapped his arms around my shoulders, pressing our flesh together. He gave me a slow kiss, during which my already stirring nether regions came to full attention. "Honey," he said as our lips parted, "I'm not going to pretend to be something I am not, even for the sake of détente. Are you?" I took a step back, looked down, then raised my eyes to his. "Well, not right now." I woke in the middle of the night in a sort of post-coital dreaminess. I was lying halfway on my stomach with one leg straight and the other crooked up between Peter's legs. I was disoriented for a moment, then realized I'd been woken by the sound of a soft click. I glanced over Peter's shoulder at the clock on the nightstand, which read 12:57. I gently extricated my leg from his and rolled over on my back, wondering what the noise had been. Suddenly, I felt my heart constrict. I could sense movement somewhere. I tried to scan the room without moving my head, not wanting to show any sign of being awake. Through the darkness, I finally made out that the door was opening. For a moment, I thought I was having my Saddam Hussein nightmare again, but my racing pulse and rapid breathing soon convinced me otherwise. "Peter," I anxiously whispered into his ear. "Peter, wake up!" "Hmm?" he said so loudly I almost jumped out of my skin. "Shh! There's someone in here." "What?" "Alex," James's voice said quietly in the dark. "James!" I reached over and switched on the lamp on my side of the bed. The three of us recoiled from the sudden flood of light. When my eyes had adjusted, I found a young soldier standing at the foot of the bed, clad only in a pair of tattered briefs. Apparently his makeover hadn't extended beneath the surface. "Is something wrong?" "I have question." "You have question now?" I said, my eyes widening. Then I quickly corrected myself. "I mean, you have a question now?" "Yes." He came around the side of the bed and sat on the corner. I glanced at Peter, who I suddenly felt was very conspicuous. "What is it?" And James stared at me with those big Bambi eyes, marshalling his courage, then said, "You are homosex?" I blinked. "Personified." His forehead wrinkled. Peter sighed in my direction. "Yes, we are." James turned back to me. Your mother, she knows this. Well, you could hardly expect us to be sleeping in the same bed under the same roof as my own mother without her knowing about it. I didn't mean to sound snippy, but I was so flabbergasted by the direct question and the late hour that I couldn't help it. This is yes, he said blankly. Yes. He looked even more distressed. He raised his hands, holding his palms a few inches apart. You need to use much more little words. It was my turn to look perplexed. Smaller words? I think he means fewer, Peter said in a tone for which I would be getting him back later. Honestly, Alex, English is his second language. She does not mind this. Your mother? James asked. Of course not. She loves me. Us. He was silent for several seconds, during which his breathing quickened. At last he said, You see, Alex, Peter, you see. There was mounting urgency in his voice. I am homosex too. I almost said, Oh, dear God. But the look on James's face kept me from exclaiming. His eyes were wide and searching both of our faces as if he feared a very elaborate trap had been set for him, the object of which had been to trick him into this confession. For the second time that day, I felt like crying just looking at him. He had the panic-stricken look of someone who has just made his first bold step out of the closet and is prepared to retreat at the slightest sign of rejection. But his fear went beyond that, although I really didn't have any concrete information on how gays were treated in his country. I didn't doubt that he could have been killed for admitting it there. But then in a rush, something else dawned on me. This wasn't the first time he'd admitted to his sexuality. That's wonderful, said Peter with heartfelt sincerity. James's tension began to drain so quickly that he almost giggled with relief. Yes, Peter nodded. This is why you needed to come to this country, isn't it? I asked. Yes, in my country it is dangerous to be such. If anyone knew, his voice trailed off. From the worried expression on his face, the outcome must have been vividly playing through his mind. But for many years I hear about America and I think maybe I come. It is better here. They say that sex is very free. Oh, you can still buy it. Peter heaved a world-weary sigh. Alex! Sorry. I don't mean this, James explained. I mean, you can be here. Both Peter and I were momentarily stumped by this one. Then suddenly it came to me. Oh, you mean that you can be gay here, homosexual? Yes, well, for the most part. Peter muttered, Alex, fewer. James sat staring soberly at his own knee for almost a minute. Then he said very quietly, This is good. He rose from the bed. I think I can sleep now. He started for the door, but paused when Peter spoke. James, I think you were very brave. Thank you, he replied with a rueful smile, and that showed he didn't share the same opinion of himself, but for the first time there was some warmth in his tone. It was as if he finally felt like part of a family. He turned and left the room. Jesus, said Peter, putting his right hand behind his head and lying back against his pillow. What do you think of that? I think he's a bastard, I exclaimed. Peter looked absolutely shocked. James? No, Nelson. Why? Because now it all makes sense. What are you talking about? Do you remember what Nelson said when we asked him why James needed to leave Iraq? He said he has his reasons. So James must have told what his reason was. Nelson knew all along. Of course he did. So what? Don't you see? James is gay. That's why Nelson wanted him to stay with us. There was a beat. Then Peter said, You're probably right, but so what? So why didn't Nelson tell us that to begin with? He shrugged. I don't know. Probably more of his need-to-know crap. Well, tomorrow I'm going to tell him we need to know. I mean, what was the point in setting James up with us if he wasn't going to tell us he was gay? I don't know, honey. He yawned and turned over on his side. Worry about it in the morning, will you? Let's get some sleep. I lowered my head back onto my pillow. A gay Iraqi soldier. What will they think of next? A Gay Mysteries audiobooks. I think it is easy to hate a label, but a face humanizes the word. So this effort is twofold. To offer comfort to those like myself that your world didn't end because you don't fit into the view of acceptable society on both sides. And in hopes of helping those with family that are LGBTQ, that it doesn't mean we are aliens from the child they once knew. Reassure them so they can maybe be supportive at the same time, being true to their values.